Thanks for hanging in there, ladies and gentlemen. We appreciate it. It's the last session of the day, and we're glad that you stuck around because we think there's going to be some benefit for you in learning a little bit about Resource Manager. Resource Manager is an application that has been built exclusively for Sage 300 to manage the use for non-Sage 300 employees who want to be able to submit expense reports, in addition to time sheets and other requisitions like purchase orders and AP invoices. Today's session is going to be focusing on the expense management side of Resource Manager, and next week we'll have a couple of sessions on time management and purchase requisitions. But for today, we're focusing on expenses. So what I want to do is explain what this hybrid cloud solution is all about. When we talk about a hybrid solution, it's a combination of a Windows application that installs within Sage 300 and where we can configure the system to work with the rest of Sage 300 based on a series of integration options that you have within the application. So for the expense transactions, you can create transactions off the expense entries that post directly to the general ledger, or you can put them through accounts payable for reimbursement purposes, or you can send them over to the Canadian payroll module. You can also incorporate budgetary controls around your expenses, which allow you to do that budget checking at a GL account level, tied specifically to GL account transactions. Now you also have a division, department, and region breakdown where you can assign individuals who belong to a certain department, division, or region, and that can be assigned a specific GL segment code so that these transactions are being properly posted to the correct GL accounts. And it also has an impact on the approvals, since we can automatically route approvals to your department, region, or division manager. And this is where you would specify that individual. These workflows are assigned to an individual employee that determines how their expense reports get routed through the organization. So in a case like this, we can define different roles, whether they be my supervisor, which is defined as my direct report, or the region, division, department manager breakdown, or you might use our approver group feature that allows you to define 3 or 4 managers and tell the system that as long as 2 of these 3 or 4 managers approve the expense report, then it will be allowed to get posted into Sage 300. The other thing I want to highlight here, and I'll show this as part of the presentation, is our decision action. A decision action allows you to establish your own business logic around the approval workflows. In this case, we're using dollar value thresholds. So any amounts that are less than $100 can be assigned to my supervisor, but expenses between $100 and $500 go to my region manager, and then expenses that are greater than $500 go to the big boss. Now you can use any type of variable to create conditions for the logic that you want the approval process to follow, and that could include things like budgetary controls or other criteria such as the item being purchased. Notice that when we define these workflow approvals that we can use email as an alert function. So as expenses are being submitted, rejected, or approved, we can create our own email templates that allow you to notify managers to do the approvals or employees that their expenses have been approved. So once all of that is configured, the last thing is to define at the employee or employee group level the types of expenses that they can record on those expense reports. Notice that we assign a GL account so that the employee doesn't have to know the GL account as they're doing their expenses. You simply can define the expense codes that are valid, and then we have this auto insert feature so that when they create a new expense report, it will automatically populate these lines on the expense report. Now, in addition to the budgetary control, we have what's called over limit checking. This allows you to create per diem dollar values or monthly or year-to-date amounts that you can specify to control the expenses that people are spending, or simply to give managers and employees a warning that they're going over a preset limit. Now, if you use a warning, then it's going to simply pop up a message, but allow you to post or click through that screen. So it doesn't stop you unless you define an over-limit checking as an error condition. And then in that case, it will stop the employee from submitting the expense report. So it gives you a lot of flexibility in how you manage the expenses that the employees are incurring. And then this will be tied directly to that employee's account, so you can keep track, and we'll show you a report that manages the expenses for each employee. The last thing to highlight is just the fact that as you're defining your expense system, you can force attachment checking if you want. Again, that can either be a warning or an error. So if it's an error condition, then they must attach supporting documentation to the expense report. You can approve these expenses at a detailed line level or a document level. And you can also limit expenses as a per daily diem, monthly, yearly, or year-to-date basis. It also links to a travel request system, so you can pre-authorize travel and hotel expenses. And you can also generate cash advances automatically against travel requests if you need to. When it comes time to actually setting up the expense codes themselves, this is where you would define the GL account distribution. Depending on the type of expense, it may be reimbursable to the employee, or if it's based on a corporate credit card, then we can flag it that way so that employees would record the expense on their expense report, but it would not be reimbursable to them. So these are a number of ways that we allow you to manage and control the expenses for your employees with a fully integrated web portal, which is what we'll use to enter, submit, and approve the expense report today. But just before we go there, the last thing I want to highlight is the fact that the taxes that apply for expenses can vary province by province and territory. So we allow you to define those taxes for each jurisdiction, particularly in the case of meals expenses, where in Canada we have GST, HST, and PST ramifications, where certain taxes are reimbursable and certain are not. Then you can break those out by jurisdiction to calculate the appropriate amount of tax based on which province or territory these expenses were incurred. And in the case where you bill back expenses to customers, you can define what that billing rate is. And we also support multi-currency. So having said all of that, when we go to enter expenses, you want to make the system as easy to use as possible so that employees can use the system to their advantage and it doesn't become a huge burden for them. So what you need to do is simply show them how to log into the system. You can use an ID and a password that's based on their Windows ID and password, or it could be an employee name, first name, last name, or last name, first name. And they're presented with a web portal. Now, this web portal can be configured and customized to your company's requirements based on the applications that you've licensed through the Resource Manager module. We're going to be focusing on expenses, but as I mentioned, we'll be talking about timesheets and purchase and AP invoice requisitions next week. So when I click on the expense, it opens up a view of historical expense reports that I've already submitted and have been posted through for reimbursement. I can also show those expenses that have been approved but not reimbursed, those still awaiting approval, any that might have been rejected, and any expense reports that I've created that I haven't submitted for approval yet. When I click on the new button, it will display an expense form for me. But just so you know, we have an administrative portal in the system that allows you to configure these forms for your employees by employee group or individual employee. And what you can do by Sage 300 Company is you can define which columns appear on the expense report. So you can choose both for the submitter, the employee, and the approver, which fields are displayed, and if they are displayed, are they editable? And this gives you better control over what kind of information you want the employees to track. The system also comes with multiple language support, so you can support English, French, Spanish. All of these different languages can be supported, and that can be done at an employee group level or an individual employee. And then you have other controls about whether you're requiring sign-on and other requirements in the system. Now, as you notice, it auto-inserted 4 expense lines for me. And if I were to just go ahead and submit this expense report, or try to, you notice I get a warning that no attachment is added. That's because I put the warning that we want attachments to support the expenses on our expense report. But because I made it a warning and not an error, I could go through that warning, and then it would tell me that my task line is invalid. So even though we're entering these expenses through a web portal, I'm fully integrated with Sage 300 in the back office, and it's going to validate the information against what's required in order to set up this entry within Sage 300. But as I mentioned, this transaction cannot enter Sage 300 until it's been fully and properly approved by the appropriate people, as denoted on our approval workflow. So now, if I were to submit, and again, it's going to give me the warning about the attachment, it will expose for me an approval audit trail. And what I want you to notice is that right now, the expense report is being sent to Bev Fraser, who is my regional manager. If Bev was away, she could substitute another manager. But let's say for our purposes, we've submitted the expense report and then recognized that we've made a mistake, so we need to unsubmit the expense report. So as long as the expense report has not been approved, I could submit and unsubmit an expense report and make any changes that I choose to. So in this case, my airfare was actually $450 because I was going to a conference in Chicago. And I want to attach supporting documentation for the airfare. So I'm going to put in an airfare receipt, and then I browse to pick up the airfare that I want to record against this expense report. And so I'm going to go and grab my airfare receipt, which will go back to right in here. Let's say this one here, and I will save that with that detail line. Now I've got a hotel expense, let's say that was $320, and that was the Hilton in Chicago. And again, I want to attach a receipt. So this is my hotel receipt. So this assumes that that receipt's been emailed, and I can browse to the downloads folder, which would pick up items that have come through email. And I'm going to pick that up. That was the same month of October. And there's the folio that I want to attach. And now I've got supporting documentation for my airfare and my hotel. Let's say my taxi was $45, and that was airport to hotel. And I won't put an attachment there. I'll just go ahead and save the expense report. Now, what I want you to notice is a couple of things. I could check the limit, which would allow me to see for air, hotel, and taxi how I'm doing against my limit for the month. And you can see I've got this available, and on this report, I've just incurred those expenses. And because this is a new month, I'm starting off with a new limit of $1,200. I also have my GL account budget, which was my 6660 travel expense account. This report, I'm recording $815. I have a budget of $18,000, and so far I have used $18,000 is my monthly budget, so $216,000 is my annual budget, and I can see so far this year that I've got an actual expense of $229,000, so I'm actually over budget, and I've got $12,000 in pending expenses, so I'm actually over budget based on my GL account budget. So I've got both the GL account budget as well as my limit on expenses that I can be viewing as an employee, and that will also be visible for the managers. Now notice when I submit the expense report this time, because my approval workflow was based on dollar value thresholds, now instead of Bev Fraser approving my expenses, because they're over $500, it goes up to Bruce Lee, who's the big boss. So that's how the workflow approvals can work, where the system will automatically know how to route the document based on, in this case, dollar value thresholds. Now I can have multiple levels of approval as well that will determine who and when people can approve my expenses. So now that I've submitted that expense report, I'm going to sign out, and then I will sign in as the manager, which is Bruce Lee. Now Bruce can log in, and you notice that we had the substitution feature here. If Bruce had been away, what he could have done is he said, I want someone else to do my approvals for the first week of December. And so from the 1st to the 8th, he could designate one of the other managers to do his approvals. Now, if he was away and he forgot, then we still have an option using the administrative portal to check through what we call the to-do list. The to-do list allows me to go in, and as a back office function, I can pick up documents from every Sage 300 company in the system, including my expense report from today. You see December 1st is the submitted date, submitted by me, Robert Lavery. Now, if we want, we could approve this as a back office function, or we could say, I want to transfer this to one of the other managers, and maybe in this case, have Bev do it as a region manager. So this is a way for you to avoid bottlenecks in the system and keep those expenses moving to make sure that they get approved on a timely basis. One other thing I'd like to show you while I'm here in the admin portal is our scheduled routines. Let's say you want expense reports submitted by Friday, 12 noon every week. So what you can do is you can schedule a reminder email to go out based on a predefined routine. So it could be a submission reminder to make sure that expenses are getting submitted on a timely basis, or it could be an approval reminder for managers to make sure that they're getting those expenses approved so that they can be reimbursed on a timely basis. So these are scheduled processes that we build into the system to allow you to have the system be the monitor for the activities around your expense reporting. So in this case, let's say Bruce is in the office and he would get a notification either through the portal or on his smartphone device, because when you license a user on the portal, you also have the ability to download a free app. And I'll show you that when we complete the approval process here. So here's the expense report that we set up, and we see there's some document attachments. So I see an airfare receipt that I can open up and check to see about my flight itinerary as supporting documentation. I also have the folio from my hotel in Chicago in Hilton. So those supporting documents are there and available for review during the approval process. And again, I've got the check limit function where I can open up and see what this is doing to my GL account budgets, as well as any per diems that have been set up against these types of expenses. Now, if for some reason I wanted another manager to review these expenses, I could transfer them to another manager, but that would be an ad hoc change to the standard workflow approval, which is something you may or may not want to do. If you found yourself constantly making changes to the workflow approval, then that might indicate that it's time to readjust the standard workflow. But in this case, for demonstration purposes, I'll just simply say okay. And because there's just one level of approval, the expense report is approved, and then it's automatically set up within Sage 300. So as soon as we have a final approval on these expenses, then we will see a transaction batch for expenses created automatically within Sage 300. This is the highest level of integration that you can accomplish with any third-party application. This allows you to use a remote web portal for people who need to submit expenses, for managers that need to approve expenses, but neither one of them needs to log into Sage 300 and consume an expensive Landpack license. And yet, you know, once the transaction has been fully approved, it's going to automatically get updated within Sage 300. And the information that gets set up in the expense batch within Sage 300 includes all of the details that we've captured in the web portal. So for example, the expense entry has a breakdown of the expense codes, the fact that they are reimbursable, the dollar amounts, the expense distribution to the GL, and then the attachments that are supporting the expenses. The approval audit trail with the date and the timestamp and any comments is also brought into Sage 300. The attachments are here and visible now as an attachment in Sage 300. So everything that we've captured in the portal has been set up in Sage 300 because it's all part of the same database. The transaction totals and any expenses, optional field data, and then the document details itself. And here again, I could check against budget within a back office and see how I'm doing against my limits. So all of that information comes across seamlessly into the system. Now, when I'm ready to post, I would just simply post, because in this case, what I've done is I've told the system I want to reimburse through accounts payable. So when I post my expense voucher, it's going to create an AP invoice, which means in this case, the employee is also set up as a vendor within accounts payable, and the AP invoice number to be reimbursed against will match the expense voucher number EV0028. Now, of course, I could override that if I wanted to, but I think it's nice for audit trail purposes that the document number for my expense report matches the AP invoice number that I'm recording against. So when I decide to post this transaction, it will generate the AP invoice for me. So we've been able to capture the expenses as close to the activity as possible by having the employee enter and submit those expenses themselves, being able to access information from Sage 300 in order to ensure that the accounting data is accurate, but they haven't had to know the GL account. They've just simply used the information that's in the system to record that expense report. Managers have been able to approve it online, and then only at that point does the transaction get committed to Sage 300. And again, there's no import-export, there's no rekeying. The transactions are recorded and seamlessly updated into the financial accounting modules. So in our case, this is an EN, which stands for Resource Manager, transaction batch. The last entry in the batch are my expenses from today, December the 1st. I've got my air, my hotel, and my taxi distributed to the GL account. Now, for some reason, you needed to make a change within AP to a different expense account, you still have that option to do so. But all the other details are here and recorded, including the comments. Now, if they wanted to see the approval audit trail and the supporting documents, then they could drill from accounts payable back down into Resource Manager, where those details are stored. You're still within Sage 300, but you're keeping the detail about those expenses within the expense module. So anyone in accounts payable can drill down to see who did the approval, when they did the approval, any comments they made, plus view any of the attachments that were associated with that particular expense report. So all the detail is maintained and it's moved seamlessly into the Sage 300 back office module. So that's how we would manage expenses for you by giving remote access to employees that aren't typically within Sage 300, the ability to record, submit, and then have managers approve these expenses. So to finish off, let me jump down and show you a quick report. If we look at something like the expense history report, These are just standard Crystal reports that you can see. They have the ability to sort these expenses on a percentage basis by period, and you can include certain details if you'd like. Of course, you can customize Crystal for different types of reports, or you could run these reports against Sage Intelligence. But here's just a breakdown for this particular employee, their airfare, their car rentals, their hotel and taxi, with a breakdown by period and a percentage so you can see how much they're spending on a periodic basis. So I'll finish off the presentation with that and open the floor for any questions that might have come in.
I do have some questions here. So the first one is, how many levels of approval does the system support?
All right, very good question. In the approval workflows, technically we can support up to 99 levels of approval. So we don't know of anyone that's gone above more than, say, 4. But yeah, technically in the system, 99 levels of approval can be supported.
Does it cost more if I want an employee to use the mobile app and the web portal?
Okay, very good question. So just to explain the licensing here again, the portal is a standard user license. So for instance, when we look at the expenses, that would be $40 US one time per employee. So it's a named employee license, but it's very inexpensive compared to a Sage user within Sage 300. And once you license that user in the portal, you have access at no charge to either the Android mobile app or the Apple iOS app. And by simply clicking on one of those logos, you get taken to the portal where you can install the app on your smartphone or your iPad, whatever the case may be. So there is no additional cost for the mobile apps. When you license the web portal, you get free access to the mobile apps. Thanks for that question.
Does Resource Manager support multi-currency expenses?
Very good. Yes. Multi-currency, just as in Sage 300, is supported. So if you turn on multi-currency in Sage 300, then what you would see on the expenses here is the ability to store multiple currencies against your expenses. So if you are running multi-currency, then you will be able to support expenses in different currencies, and the expense form will actually access the rate table for multi-currency in Sage 300. So if I enter a US dollar expense into a Canadian company, it will show me the US expense converted to its Canadian dollar equivalent. So yeah, we certainly do support currency expenses, different currency expenses.
And the last question I have here is, what happens if you find an error in an employee expense report?
Very good question. If we find errors, I don't know if you noticed, I didn't really highlight this. As we're going through the approval process, there are options within the approval workflow to determine, does it go back to the prior approval or all the way back to the employee, and what happens. So if you define the approval workflow in that way, then when you reject an expense, if you find an error, then you can send it back to the employee. But you also can allow rejection of expenses in the back office. If for some reason it's gone all the way through the approval process, but there's an error in it, and you don't want to record that expense in Sage 300, but it's now been posted to Sage 300 because it got approved in the portal, then you can reject that expense within the Resource Manager module here in the expense transactions batch. So even though it's been approved operationally, if finance and accounting find an error, you have the option as the last say to reject that expense and even delete it out of the back end system. Now you can also allow the edit of expenses during the approval process. So if a manager finds an error during the approval process, you can have them actually change the expense report on behalf of their employee and just put a note in for their approval that a change was made. So there are a couple of different ways you can manage that, but depending on what process you're at, you can either reject it or delete it from Sage 300, or if it's still outside Sage 300, you can either send it back to the employee or you can make the change as the manager. That's a great question. Thank you for that.
Perfect. And it does look like that's all the questions that we have for this session. So I'd just like to thank you again, Robert, for presenting today.
Thank you very much, Remington.
And with that being all of the sessions for today, I would like to thank everyone for taking time out of their busy day to join us for BAASS Connect Virtual Explore the Sage Ecosystem Part 1. We hope that you found the sessions to be beneficial. All attendees should have received a survey today at 3:45 Eastern Standard Time, and in order to receive a certificate of attendance, you will need to complete the survey. If you have not yet received the email, please check your junk box. As a reminder, all of today's sessions have been recorded and will be circulated to you. If you have asked a question that was not answered, we will have someone from BAASS follow up with you. And as a reminder, our next event is this Thursday, December 3rd on Sage Distribution and Manufacturing. We hope you can join us there.